Good morning to anyone who is tuning in. We're just going to give this a few minutes for people to get logged on. Just giving it a couple minutes.
Okay. I know, I see that we're actually on live right now. And so I will just say I am really, really excited to have you joining us to tell us about the impact that suicide loss has on survivors.
I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I feel very, very short down here.
There is not actually this big of a height difference between us.
I know. Okay. And so when you're ready.
Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So good morning to anyone who is tuning in. My name is Jennifer White. I'm an associate marriage and family therapist at Calabasas Counseling and Grief Recovery Center. I initially became a therapist because I experienced the loss of my mom to suicide when I was 23. And that sort of set me on a journey of healing. And I enjoy working with survivors of suicide the very most. And it's a large percentage of my client population. So I wanted to present this presentation in honor of Suicide Awareness Month. So this will take us through how one suicide loss can really ripple out into a community and the different ways that it might show up for us clinicians. And I know the slides are a bit small, so if you need to zoom in, please feel free to do that. And then we also will send out a link with the slides and to the course format where this is after the live stream. So this is Ripples of Loss, supporting survivors of suicide loss.
And it's being recorded.
And it's being recorded. So there's that. So this will really acknowledge the unique challenges of suicide loss. It's important to recognize that there are really distinct difficulties that survivors of suicide loss face. They're not coming to us with a maybe more typical presentation of grief simply because of the stigma that they may encounter in the community. So in this presentation, you're going to learn how we can encourage open communication and empathy. I'll be providing some resources and be promoting self-care and resilience and understanding the wide-reaching impact of suicide loss. I'm also going to go over some of the ways that we can address both the trauma that survivors of suicide loss experience, as well as the grief and the way that that shows up for us clinically.
Make it a big screen.
Yes, let me go here. Okay. We're also going to talk about the triple threat of trauma that survivors of suicide loss experience. So we'll get to that in the presentation. And we're going to talk about ways that as clinicians, we can reduce some of the stigma that we might hold in order to make the therapeutic space more healing for our clients. So when someone dies by suicide, the people connected to that loss are called survivors of suicide loss. Sometimes this term is confusing for people because people might think, oh, that's someone who has survived a suicide attempt, but it's actually the terminology that we use to describe people who have experienced a loss. And for many years, suicide prevention organizations shared this statistic that each suicide impacted 6 other people. But what we know now is that that number is actually much, much higher. So more recent studies have shown that it's actually closer to 135 people who are exposed when one person dies by suicide. And so we're going to look together at some of those different people in a community because we always think of the people closest to the person who died by suicide, but we also need to take into consideration how this loss ripples across the community and might affect people not as close to the survivor or to the person who died. So this is our case example today, and it's presented in the form of an obituary. And I'll share that. It is with profound sadness that we share the passing of Officer Jones, 56, who died unexpectedly on 9/10/24. A dedicated police officer of 17 years, George was known for his unwavering commitment to serving his community. Born on 8/29/68 in Sacramento, George was not only a dedicated police officer, but was also a devoted father, son, partner, and friend. He leaves behind his mother, Carol, fiancée Shannon, children Sarah, Amy, Kenny, and Andrew. In lieu of flowers, donations may be made to the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and a private burial will take place. So I just want you to sit with that information for a minute and think about the people in this scenario who you already know have been impacted by this one death. So let's look at this. There's obviously some people named in the obituary, right? His fiancée, Shannon, his mother, Carol, and also his children, Sarah, Kenny, Amy, and Andrew. So these people are really in the epicenter of the loss. They're the people that we'll think of first, right? When we see this case or we read about it in the news, but they're really not the only ones impacted. So we're going to spend some time now thinking about other people who we might find in our offices who also need support after George's death. So here's just a few of the examples. I'm sure that people watching at home can think of more as well. We have George's neighbors, his ex-wife, his church congregation, his police unit, his cousins, nephews, nieces, aunts, uncles, and godchildren, the friends of his children, and the friends of his fiance, the friends of his mother, the friends of his ex-wife, citizens that George served as a police officer, even if they only had one interaction with him. Maybe it was really powerful for them. His friends, the barista that George saw every morning, George's police officer partner, his fiance's children, his barber, his firefighter and EMT colleagues, the woman who found his body, and the therapist that George saw 2 years ago. So you can see that while we may not think about these people immediately, they could be really impacted by this loss. So now we know how many people have been impacted, and we're going to look at some of the ways that we can support these survivors. And many of these survivors are experiencing traumatic grief, ambiguous loss, disenfranchised grief, or a combination of all three. And so I want to make sure that everyone has a really good understanding of those three different types of grief and how they might show up in our offices. So traumatic loss is a specific type of loss experience that is typically sudden, unexpected, and distressing in nature. Traumatic loss often involves violence or a very upsetting stressor. A loss that includes a traumatic event is likely to cause higher levels of distress in grievers. So clinically, when we're dealing with someone who's experienced traumatic loss, it's important that we understand not only the grief component, but also the fact that we're likely going to be working with someone who could develop symptoms of PTSD. So we need to be dealing with the trauma as well as the grief-related symptoms. So let's think of some people that might fall into this category. My helpful assistant, Debbie, maybe could think of someone between George's fiance and George's neighbors who's more likely to experience a traumatic loss, traumatic grief.
I think probably George's fiance.
Yes, George's fiance.
Okay. I think also I wanted to add is that it also increases the likelihood of prolonged grief disorder as well,
Definitely.
Which often involves traumatic grief.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that. So let's talk about some ways that we can support traumatized grievers. So when we're working with clients who have experienced traumatic loss, it's vital to treat the traumatic event while also addressing the client's grief. We're often kind of the first responders in this situation because many people in the griever's life maybe have supported them. They've brought over food, they've helped with the funeral, but they don't necessarily have the same ability that we hold as clinicians to be able to tolerate the difficult details of the trauma and the person's grief-related feelings at the same time. So we might really be their first experience with someone who can handle both of those components at the same time. So it's really important that we validate the client's feelings and send signals of safety by asking specific but sensitive questions about how their loved one died and making sure that we use appropriate language. So this is when it's really important to be mindful to use words like died by suicide rather than committed suicide. Many survivors of suicide loss, myself included, feel that committed suicide perpetuates the stigma that we have experienced because it implies a crime or wrongdoing. So when asking questions related to the traumatic incident, it's important to be mindful of pacing. So it's common for clients to need multiple sessions to fully share the story of the traumatic event or loss. Or something that I find a lot too is you think that you have all of the details, but then many, many sessions later, more details will emerge as the reactivity to the trauma starts to decrease. So just be aware that it may not be linear.
Or I would imagine that they end up getting new information.
Yes, absolutely.
Or something that they just hadn't even thought about, which I think then changes the puzzle. And it's like, oh, wow, I'm missing these pieces. Now I got to reconfigure the whole puzzle of the relationship.
Yes. One of the things that I see so often, specifically with survivors of suicide loss, is when they get the autopsy or toxicology report. And it opens up a whole new understanding of either their person's intentionality or lack of intentionality, and there's a whole new narrative around that when those results come back. And so that's, often 8 weeks, 12 weeks
really
after the loss. So that's really important to be mindful of. So when we're treating trauma, we need to be assessing a client's resources. So you can do this right from the beginning, and it's really vital with traumatic grief. So we need to learn, what kind of support have they received so far? One thing that Debbie taught me that I always ask any griever, but especially someone facing traumatic grief, is what has been helpful to you since your person died and what has been not helpful since your person died. And unfortunately, we find that people's not helpful list is much, much longer than their helpful list.
Can I talk more about the reason for that? I'll scoot in and
Scooch
say hi. Is that I think that it starts to normalize, or it starts to validate and normalize of, people around you are really uncomfortable and they don't know what to say. And especially with suicide loss, there's such a stigma, and so people won't say anything, or they will offer all this, advice and or things that all the reasons why the person shouldn't be, should be feel grateful or shouldn't be feeling bad. And so I think from the very beginning of asking what's been helpful and then what's not been helpful. And I know, we've talked is that, when somebody says, oh, everybody's been really, really helpful, I'll say, you're so lucky, because 85% of what grievers hear come from people who are well-meaning, but it's not helpful. And then people kind of start dropping their guard and they go, well, let me tell you about. And it reduces their sense of isolation.
Yeah, it's not to make them feel like nobody's doing a good enough job supporting them. It's to validate those really uncomfortable feelings that they may experience when someone has good intentions and is trying to help them, but misses the mark. And that needs to be acknowledged with us. Yeah.
And trauma and grief are so incredibly intertwined. And we've got great tools of dealing with trauma. We've got EMDR, we've got brain spotting, we've got all these different ways of being able to address the trauma. And we say, please don't forget all of the grief, all of the unfinished business, all of the, what I call, the regrets, the resentments, and the unexpressed appreciations and gratitude.
The relationship.
Yeah.
So important. Speaking of EMDR, so clients experiencing traumatic grief may benefit greatly from EMDR and other somatic therapies. Resources from these models can be introduced immediately to support a client. So I am an EMDR trained clinician, and I have found that when clients come into me, fresh after a loss, one of the things that I can offer to them is just some really basic resources from EMDR, butterfly tapping, deep breathing, a safe, calm place. And they're very happy to have a little bit of relief or something to turn to when they do feel overwhelmed, which they will continue to experience. So when we're helping clients who've experienced traumatic loss, we need to address both the trauma and the grief. We need to validate clients' feelings and use sensitive language. We need to pace discussions around the trauma carefully, as clients may need multiple or many sessions to share their story. We need to assess the client support system and what has been helpful or harmful, and consider using EMDR or somatic therapies. So now let's talk about the triple threat of trauma. So this is a term that I heard used by a mother who had a child who died from overdose, and she was talking about it in reference to both suicide and overdose loss. And I thought it was so brilliant because it perfectly describes both my personal experience and what I've seen clinically, which is that survivors of suicide loss often come to us with a triple threat of trauma. So they are often grappling with the trauma of their loved one's actual life. So that might be someone who struggled with mental illness, addiction, or had previous suicide attempts. And then there is the trauma of, oh, shoot, I can't click like that on this version of it. Then there is the trauma of,
Just
if I scroll down.
Or no, you just go to the next one and it'll bring you to the next slide.
Oh, okay, I see.
Yeah.
Okay. So then there's the trauma of the actual death. So, suicide deaths are often violent in nature. And so there are also difficulties with handling afterlife affairs. So it is more complicated for a survivor of suicide loss to set up a burial and a funeral, to make calls about life insurance. Even though we've come a long way as a society, a lot of those stigmas are still encountered by people when they're trying to go through the after death process, which can be traumatizing. They're also more likely to experience hurtful comments and judgments and a lack of support. So they're experiencing, all of these different traumas for these three different parts of the death. So really important to remember. So now let's talk about disenfranchised grief. Disenfranchised grief occurs when an individual experiences a significant loss that isn't acknowledged or valued by others, or when their method of grieving is deemed socially unacceptable. Kenneth Doka created the term disenfranchised grief to define a loss that is not openly acknowledged or publicly mourned. And disenfranchised grief can be felt as both deeply painful and invisible to the griever. So in George's life, we can think about who might fit into this category. And for me, the one that comes up the most in this case study is George's ex-wife. So it might be very complicated for her to grieve this loss. And, she might receive comments like, oh, but you hated him, or did you know it was coming? Or did he ever make an attempt when you guys were married? Things like that. And she also may not feel that she has a space or a right. That's a word that people say a lot, a right to grieve in a more public way. And so when we're supporting survivors of suicide loss, like if George's ex-wife walks into our room to get support after she's experienced this loss, I think that our first job is to make them feel seen and supported, and to make sure that they know that their feelings are valid when they're working with us. And it's important to acknowledge the gravity of their loss and also provide psychoeducation on suicide loss.
I think that's the thing with disenfranchised grief, is that it is the invisible mourner. It is that this feeling of you don't have the right to grieve, or that the griever takes that on themselves. So I don't know why I'm making such a big deal, but it's more of this invalidation from others.
Yeah, and that hierarchy of grief that we always see.
Exactly.
Where everybody sort of, unconsciously decides who has it the worst.
Right.
And that person gets all the support, and then it just trickles down throughout the system.
Well, and the whole comparison thing,
negates
everybody's grief.
Yes.
Everybody. And then there can only be one. And then how are you going to judge that? And those are that's such a huge problem with the social part of grief is the hierarchy, is the comparison, is the minimization.
Yes.
And, and the, you should be grateful because da, 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 da. Yeah.
I think this happens in the friend community a lot too. So many people are, really deeply impacted when they lose a friend to suicide, and they don't get that support that they needed. And so those are the people that I especially really encourage to, attend community events like, suicide prevention walks or a support group to meet other people who have been through it and know how impactful it is, because people in their personal lives may not give them the space for that.
Good point.
So now we're going to talk about ambiguous loss. So the term ambiguous loss was first coined by Pauline Boss, PhD, and is used to describe any loss without resolution. So this type of loss might be felt by survivors of suicide loss, actually even before their loved one died and after. So with suicide loss, if we think about the fact that I think the statistic is like 80 to 90% of people who die by suicide struggled with mental health issues before their death, there is a higher likelihood that people in their life may not know if the death was intentional, or in some cases, if they've even died or not. So if we look at this case example, if we think about people like George's barista, or even some of George's neighbors, or some of the people in the community who notice that he's gone, but they may not ever know that he actually died. But they may still feel this profound sense of loss of like, hey, I saw that guy every single morning at Starbucks for 8 years, and he was always so kind to me, and like, what happened to him?
Yeah.
And that those things actually can show up for us as clinicians in the room when we're treating people. I know that a lot of times I'll have someone come in for a primary loss, but as we start to do a loss timeline, I'll hear about one of these more ambiguous losses that is actually really informing the primary loss, because that one remains activated in the person. So we really need to have the skills to be able to go back and help them resolve some of that unfinished business. And it's important to know that when we're talking about ambiguous loss, there's two different ways that we can define it. There's physical absence with psychological presence, and then there's psychological absence with physical presence. So let's think about some of these ways. Like I was thinking, we don't know from this obituary, from this case study, what George's relationship with his children or with his ex-wife was like. Maybe there was some estrangement there, or some, cutoff there. And if there was, they were experiencing ambiguous loss before he even died. And then, like the example of the barista is someone who might experience ambiguous loss after the death.
There's also, I think, the ambiguous loss beforehand for somebody who has really struggled with mental illness
or addiction,
or addiction, and the that they were present, but they physically present, but they were emotionally so incredibly cut off,
right?
And so it's almost like ambiguous loss also is kind of ambiguous grief. There's two different kinds of grief.
And it's almost a little anticipatory
grief.
Yeah. So really important to just sort of be listening for all of that. Like, what was that like for you? And recognizing that it's so much of grief work is about the relationship when the person was alive, not just from the moment they died, moving forward.
Right.
So when we're supporting ambiguous loss, therapists that work in this space, really, they might observe their clients grappling with very difficult questions surrounding the loss. And, this is where, for me as a survivor of suicide loss, the most important thing that I learned in my healing journey was to get more comfortable accepting the questions that will never be answered, rather than trying to figure it out cognitively. And I think that that's a very difficult thing for a lot of people to provide as a supporter. And that's something that we really can do as therapists.
I think it's also fueled all of that woulda, coulda, shoulda, and all of that ruminating
Mhm.
is fueled by our own helplessness
Absolutely.
and our system trying to come up with the answer,
Yes.
which we think then if we have that answer, then we'll feel better. It's
We'll
like,
feel
no,
relief.
we'll go find something else.
Yes.
Because again, it's how the helplessness manifests.
Yeah. And I think, especially with survivors of suicide loss, they hear the question, why, both internally
Yeah.
and externally,
Yeah.
so much. Why did they do it? Did you know
Right.
it was happening?
Right.
How could they do such a thing? Why would they do such a thing? And so
Yeah.
I think that the reality is, even if you say, oh, it was because X, Y, and Z, or they struggled with X, Y, and Z, for most survivors of suicide loss, there's no good reason. There
Right.
will never be a big enough answer
Right.
to that question of why. And so helping them sit with those feelings of helplessness will actually be the more therapeutic intervention. So I think we kind of addressed that. All right. So, looking forward. So in our roles as therapists, we need to be prepared to discuss suicide in general with our clients. We will be working with clients who might be actively suicidal. We will definitely be encountering clients who have experienced a suicide loss or who have been impacted maybe generationally by suicide loss. So, I really encourage therapists to just get comfortable saying the word suicide, to talking about it, and to familiarize yourself with statistics, because it will help reduce that internal stigma so that it doesn't show up in the room. And I, hope to leave you with the goal of really practicing and implementing in your life, saying died by suicide rather than committed suicide. I try to correct people very gently, even just in my personal life. I will say, oh, we prefer died by suicide. And most people really actually appreciate the correction. Also, really trying to refrain from saying things like, oh my God, I'm over here killing myself over this project, or, oh, if I ever got that behind on my notes, I'd just shoot myself. It's amazing how, before you are impacted by suicide, you may not hear people saying those things, but after you are impacted by suicide, you hear it.
To it.
And what I always say to people is, it's not, I mean, I'm many, many years away, like from my personal loss, but it's not so much that it like triggers me. I don't get like very emotional or upset when people say things like that. It's just that if I'm in a meeting, I don't necessarily want to be thinking about my personal experience with suicide. And when someone says, oh my God, I'd kill myself, it brings it up. And so just to be mindful of that, I think is really, really important, and to be kind of role models in the community of reducing that stigma. Also, of course, familiarizing yourself with numbers like 988 and 741-741, which is crisis text line, and try to learn from survivors of suicide loss about their experiences. Over the past 15 years, I've seen such a change in the way that we talk about suicide openly. And I think that there's more and more opportunities to hear from actual survivors of suicide loss about their experiences. So there's really no reason anymore for any of us to not know this stuff. So the more that we practice reducing the stigma of suicide loss in our daily lives internally, the more we will be ready to support survivors of suicide loss across this entire spectrum that we looked at today, if they show up and need our support as therapists.
Good. And so you want to tell people where to get a hold of you if they have any other questions or services that we provide?
Yes.
You provide?
Yes. So I am, like I said, I'm an AMFT at Calabasas Counseling and Grief Recovery Center. I work primarily with people who have experienced traumatic loss, so suicide, overdose, homicide, car accidents. And we're located in Calabasas. I am accepting new clients. And I can be found at calabasascounseling.com or Jennifer at calabasascounseling.com. And I'm supervised by the wonderfully brilliant Debbie Frankel. And I think that's about it. And everyone who attended will receive a link, right? And we'll post it on Facebook or something. We'll get it to the people somehow. Yeah. So thank you all for joining. I really appreciate it. And have a wonderful, beautiful day.
Thank you.